And South Korea. So what's interesting is only a third of the world's population actually lives in a country where there is considered a free press, right? That's according to the Freedom of the Press report by Freedom House. Here in Asia, we've got 40 total countries, more or less. A third, of course, are not considered free press countries. A third are partially free press countries. So really a very, very wide, diverse group. And increasingly what we've all seen in this region is an inclination toward less media access and more censorship. In places obviously like China, in Vietnam where I'm from, we feel it as well, in Thailand, and interestingly, even in places like South Korea and Japan, which actually on the index is actually much more higher in terms of supposedly countries with a free press, right? Korea and Japan are countries that are considered to have free presses, and yet there are issues there as well. So let's dive in. I mean, I would like to give you guys a baseline knowledge of where these places are in terms of media access. So I'm going to ask Steve to kick it off and just give us really brief 2 minutes. How has the junta, which came into power in 2014, how has that changed media access? It obviously gotten a lot worse.
Yes. As you all know, there was a coup d'etat, bloodless coup in Thailand a couple of years ago. The leader of that coup, the army general, has engineered himself into becoming prime minister for the indefinite future. He has created something called Article 44, which gives him sweeping powers. That also includes powers over the media. If the junta gets upset with something they see on the air or read in a newspaper, they can call in the editors, give them a talking to. In more serious cases, reporters are taken for what is called attitude adjustment, where they're taken off to a military facility for about a week, and then to be released, they have to sign a document saying that they'll behave better, and they have to get permission to leave the country. For foreign correspondents, it's not necessarily anything drastic. I have not been called in, or have any of the other foreign correspondents been called in for attitude adjustment. We're well aware that they're watching what we're writing, but what we face, I think, really pales in comparison to the average Thai. Just post on Facebook or responding to a post on Facebook now can land you in military custody. And yeah. Okay.
Do 2 minutes, Rob. What about you, Nigel? I mean, obviously, here in Seoul, we hear people say there's obviously media access issues as well, and yet it is supposedly one of the freer press countries.
Yeah, well, recently what we've seen is Korea start to plummet downwards in the rankings when it comes to press freedom, and it can be partially attributed to a change in presidency. And the current president of Korea has a legacy associated with her father, which, you know, he obviously had a lot of control over media and channels, and some of that has started to seep back into Korean society again increasingly. And the usual way in which people are controlled is through legal threats and defamation threats, and it's starting to result in a media landscape where there's a lot of self-censorship and a lot of fear about what can and can't be said and published in the Korean media, and it's certainly increasing quite quickly, and it's a worrying trend.
And we definitely want to talk about self-censorship because that is a big issue. But let me get to Brian to have him explain what's happening in Japan.
Thanks. So Japan is very similar to Korea, very open press in past years, but it also fell 11 places in the World Press Freedom rankings in the latest report published last month. And that's because Prime Minister Abe is definitely making greater efforts to control Japan's image, to limit information. He does this by limiting access. His administration limits access to officials. They sometimes call in reporters to discuss coverage, not in a threatening way, but in a very tedious way. And some of his people, there's a woman, the minister from the nefariously sounding Internal Affairs and Communications Ministry has threatened broadcasters that they could lose their license if they fail to ensure political neutrality in their coverage. And that's a very sinister sounding thing. How do they know what's really, in their minds, political neutrality means that the government's line is correct. So people have lost their jobs, especially at local media companies. Some of the broadcasters have had to resign under pressure from the government.
And Jing, 2 minutes late.
Yeah, okay. Actually, instead of talking about that, I just want to say, as the someone who's been a member of AJ for the last 20 years, I want to congratulate and thank the young people in Asia who have created this and helped organize. This is not working, but I think you can hear me. Oh, this is working out. Okay, so I just want to thank you guys for putting this together. This is incredible to see AJ grow from the U.S. across Asia and pivot to Asia, and it's so incredible to see some old friends and new friends here supporting AJA. It's incredible to have an organization like this, and I would not be where I am today without AJA. Every step of my career, somebody from AJA was there helping me, and I hope that all of you know how precious this is. So I just want to give a round of applause to AJA Asia. I don't know if Ron is still here. He's one of the secret weapons of AJA. He was sitting back there for a long time, but maybe he had to go do something else to help serve AJA. If you haven't had a chance to take this class, please do, and it'll really help you in your journey, and this very difficult journey that we're on that's getting actually harder, not easier. Ron Brown, I'm giving a shout out to you. You're back. Yay. So Dr. Ron Brown, the secret weapon of AJA. So I do want to acknowledge all of this as coming back to the idea of censorship in Asia. I think the bigger context is that we're no longer in America. It's no longer an America-centric story. It's a global story, and our audience is no longer just Americans. So you can't just be talking about, you're saying free speech and censorship. You know, free speech is a foreign concept in much of the world. Where we are in China, you know, this is just non-existent. And so we need to think about how the whole entire media landscape has changed. And we are the New York Times, and the Chinese website embodies the challenge that we face in Asia because we're trying to speak the language of the people in Chinese. So we're delivering news not in English for audience in New York who understand press freedom. We're talking to the people in their own language about their difficult issue in an overall environment that I think is harder than ever. This recent years we've had an overall crackdown on civil society. So it's not just media or foreign media, but against, you know, the church, the NGOs, the Hong Kong booksellers, you know, the all kinds of feminists, and also a tycoon who writes on Weibo and has like 34 million followers, and he was shut down because he was speaking his mind. So there's an overall sense of, you know, any opposition voice, if you speak too loudly and if you speak your mind, you will be silenced, and that is happening across the board in China.
And when you are operating in that kind of environment, how does that affect you in terms of putting out the news and what kind of news you put out?
Okay, so at the New York Times, our mission is the direct opposite of what President Xi Jinping wants. He has just done this tour across Chinese media, state-owned media, that said the media must serve the party. The media must carry the surname of the party. And so that means absolute loyalty. You serve, you're the mouthpiece of the party. But we in the New York Times, we believe in news without favor or fear, right? We publish news without favor or fear. And so we do not believe in censorship. We will not submit to censorship. However, these are challenging times, right? We all have to grow our audience, grow our revenue. We're very realistic, you know, but so we continue to operate against the tide. But I think in China, there's great sort of demand for what we do, which is uncensored news. And in an environment where you're not able to get that in the local media, we become very valuable. And despite the fact that we face an uphill battle to deliver the news and reach the Chinese audience and try to make money at it if we can, it's a challenge that I face every single day, but we're there, and I thank the New York Times. I thank one of my editors, one of the highest ranking Asian American leaders in media today, Phil Pan. Raise your hand. He's been a supporter of AAJA, and he's New York Times Asia editor. based out of Hong Kong, and I thank him. He's the founder of the Chinese website that I now run at the New York Times. So I just want to thank him for his support and for his courage and conviction to start something like this, despite how difficult times are for us.
Definitely. And I do want to get back to you because your audience has changed. But I think for many of us in operating in Asia as a foreign news organization, what we are, you guys have talked about, is that for us, the pressure is not, but we're not as exposed as the local media. And maybe Steve, you can talk about that one, because obviously the threat is always there, the harassment is also there, but it's not as acute.
Yeah, Voice of America has 45 language services, and we focus on developing world countries that don't have free media. And we have most of our people out in the field are freelancers, contractors, who are local hires, local journalists who face all sorts of intimidation. They regularly get beat up and sometimes killed because the authorities or opposition parties or whomever don't like what they're reporting. And that's the big difference, that it is the local reporters, the vernacular press that is always much more vulnerable. But I can tell you, my area of responsibility as a correspondent based out of Bangkok now, because bureaus get shut down, it now covers 20 countries. I think I can count on one hand the number of countries in that region that I can go into unhindered and report freely. But I can get in, do stuff, get out, and I'm going to be relatively safe. And also, for a foreign government to come after a foreign correspondent, we have a bit of protection. They don't necessarily don't want to engage in that battle. But if a journalist in rural Cambodia or Nepal disappears or gets killed, there's generally not a lot of repercussions. One thing I think that we can do, and I have been engaged in doing this on social media, on Twitter, for example. We had a very prominent Nepali journalist who was hauled in a few weeks ago, Kanat Dixit, a publisher, and by getting the word out on Facebook and by Twitter and publicizing that this guy was in detention, I think it did contribute to getting him out quickly, and he had a medical condition as well. So I think part of our job, and a lot of media organizations do focus on the fact of censorship and arrests, but I think it's one thing that we can definitely do more of.
The attitude adjustments, do you know what happens during that process? What does it involve?
There is a reporter who used to be with the Nation newspaper, now with Khalsad English, named Pravit Rajanafruk, Pravit, P-R-A-V-I-T. Is it spelled in English P-R-A-W-I-T or V-I-T? Pravit. W-I-T. Google him, because he's written extensively about what happened to him during his 2 different sessions of attitude adjustment. So rather than paraphrase, you can read what he wrote directly.
He's also quoted in the N3Con magazine.
There you go.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, actually, there are some nice pieces in there addressing media access in our N3 magazine, so please do take a look. Now, Nigel, you were saying earlier, we were speaking, and you were saying that obviously here, oftentimes it's the English press that, or English language media that is able to write.
I think there's still a perception, whether right or wrong in Korea, that the vast majority of people will not read stories that are written in English. So therefore, they get less attention at a national level from the government. So what we are seeing is a move towards maybe more opinionated and open media articles written in the English language in Korea, but they don't have the reach that the Korean language articles have. But it certainly is an interesting area to see, how being outside of the local language may give you a certain amount of protection.
And of course, the consequences, oftentimes they are not likely to haul a foreign journalist away to jail, but oftentimes they'll in many countries, like certainly Vietnam, they will perhaps hang your visa over you, right? I mean, they don't, it's not an explicit threat, but you always know that I have to renew my visa in about 6 months.
Yeah, two things on that. One, very recent case in Vietnam where Jonathan Head, a BBC correspondent, had accreditation, played by all the rules, jumped through all the hoops to get in there. And then a day after they got in there, right before President Obama was to land, they pulled his accreditation, accusing him of trying to talk to somebody they didn't want talking to. He denies that he did that. So even if you have the visa, the accreditation, it can be a very tenuous thing. The Foreign Correspondents Club of Thailand, which I'm on the executive board, is complaining to the authorities about what we perceive to be some sort of movement to deny visa renewals to a lot of journalists who have been there for a long time. We're also facing an issue. The Spanish news agency EFE has been expanding, creating a sort of a video hub. They put in applications for a number of new journalist visas, which have all been denied. So we think we know what's going on, that they're trying to cull the number of correspondents because somebody in the junta said there's too many of these damn foreign correspondents in this country, let's cut back on them. But we can't get any clarity, there's no transparency. And now they put out a form, this is not just for journalists, anybody renewing their visa after 90 days staying in the country has to fill out a 3-page document listing where they hang out, what bars and restaurants do you go to, and where are you on social media as well. So, it's just getting kind of ridiculous.
Sounds very Big Brother. I would think something like that along the lines in China, but do you sense that is it as
They just follow you around,
Right.
They know.
So the visa
yeah,
issue.
the visa issue and
So the New York Times has had the visa issue
Yeah.
hanging over our heads for a long time now, Bloomberg as well, right? And some of it is being resolved now, but it is something, access to the country that but aside from that, I used to work for the LA Times in China as a China correspondent, and back then we were followed and it hasn't really changed. But I have learned that when we were working here back in the, during the Olympics time, 2008, that was sort of the golden age of freedom for the press in China. And we saw some of the best journalism practiced by actually local journalists. Because obviously, when we have a free press, it's no competition. The local journalists are way better than what any of us can do as foreigners in another country. So they've done some great work. But then since then, really, it's been cracked down, severe crackdown across the board. And there's been a lot of foreign media is different. And for us, it's just the visa issue with Chinese journalists. When they write something that the government doesn't like, they could put you on CCTV and force you to confess. And things like that that's had a really negative impact.
is there a sense within if you are a foreign organization working in a country where there's such a tight press, is there a sense of that there's more of an obligation for us to report stories that local media can't? I know I've had certain instances where my local media friends will give us tips.
I can answer that. I think one thing that's important to remember is not just governments that try to practice censorship and limit information. It's really anyone in a position of authority, including companies. So, we find in Japan that, for example, and in South Korea as well, that we can write stories that a lot of local papers can't. In fact, when we recruit people, one of the things they often say is, I'm tired of having my stories killed because my editor is afraid that we're going to lose advertising, and I want to go to a company that is not afraid, that's not reliant on advertising. Having said that, at Bloomberg, we do rely on income for our terminals, and many of our terminal clients are also the financial institutions that we write stories about. And I can say that, many times we've had people tell us they hate our stories, and they may have to cancel their terminal contracts. And I can guarantee you, every time they say that, we tell them to go to hell. We don't care. That's not our business. We're in the journalism business, not the sales business. But it's an interesting. It can happen. We can write stories that the newspapers can't write.
So then, do we feel an obligation, or should we feel an obligation to do more stories, to do those stories that they can't do specifically?
Definitely. I think most Western journalists have a commitment to truth and fairness and and we're also, I think, naturally a little bit defiant, maybe passionately defiant, kind of like teenagers that suspend the development. And I think when we see the local press looking very soft on companies, it kind of irritates us. It's wrong, and Bloomberg, one of the big things we get teased about our over-reliance on numbers and statistics and things like that. But one of the reasons we're like that is we want to be able to tell a story that cannot be called incorrect, that is verifiable in the numbers. And so when these corporate people come to our offices, as they do sometimes, to have a struggle session, we can say, what do you mean? Look at the numbers. What's wrong? Is there something wrong with the story? And they say, no, we just don't like you writing the story. And we say, fine, goodbye.
I have a follow-up on that.
Yeah.
So business depends on accurate information. Don't they see the work that you do is in their best interest and the best interest of the business community? Or are they so worried about reputation that they don't care?
That's a good question. I mean, a company that's doing well, I think, appreciates that accurate information is in the best interest of everybody, including everyone in the market. Investors can rely on it and make good decisions. I think companies that are under pressure, we're having accounting scandals, as we've had in Japan, we've had a series of them, are so desperate to just get out of the limelight that they're trying to cover things up as possible. And they'll do that by limiting access. They'll try to keep us away. They'll give interviews to friendly companies and not give us interviews.
I think we should also point out that keeping information hidden in these corporations, as we've seen recently in Japan and South Korea, have legal consequences. The Takata seatbelt thing, Hiroka Tabuchi at the New York Times was out in front on that, and a lot of times local reporters, Japanese, Korean reporters know what's going on in these companies. They all talk about it, but they, as was pointed out by Brian, they can't write about it. So it makes a huge difference, and we obviously have an obligation to put those stories out. But I think we need to do more to also maybe give a little bit more scrutiny to the media in these particular countries, and it would be great to see a New York Times or a Bloomberg investigative piece about the collusion that goes on that we well know in certain countries in Northeast Asia between corporations and media.
Yeah, and actually we're going to talk a little bit about that specifically. But Jingjing, I wanted, because you had mentioned the idea of global audience, and obviously this venture for the New York Times is very different in that before you had been writing, the New York Times was writing mostly for obviously a global English-speaking audience, right, and probably mostly Americans, mostly. And now, of course, that's changed because you're writing in Chinese for the local audience. How has that, or what difficulties are you facing in that regard now that the audience has changed, and especially when it comes to censorship issues?
Right. Actually, excuse me, Mike. This is working. Okay. So the New York Times is not only speaking Chinese now; it's actually also speaking Spanish. I don't know if any of you know that. Do you know that? If you go to the main homepage, you'll see the Chinese language option, Spanish language option. So it's a real pivot towards becoming a global media company and a digital one, innovative one. We've done VR, we've done live streaming, so it's no longer just a gray lady in the old sense. But in terms of how we operate in China for the Chinese audience, I think the biggest challenge is how do you speak to a global audience, and without seeming like, oh, I'm better than you, I know better. And so while I totally agree that we have a responsibility to do the stories that the local media can't, but I hear a common criticism about foreign media coverage of China, which is that we're biased, we're tinted glasses. You hear that all the time. But sometimes if you think about it, it didn't used to matter so much when you're just writing for your American audience. Now, you're writing to the world, and if they don't get the context of what else is going on in their country, in their culture, they feel like we pick on them, we only do the negative stories. Frankly, I got that kind of criticism when I was working at the LA Times in LA. People say, why do you only write negative news about LA? Or when I was working at Newsday, like, why do you only focus on negative stories? because people live in those countries, they live in that community, they want to know why you focus on certain things and not others. And so now we're in a global village, so people want to know, why do you only focus on the negative? And so we can't just pretend we're superior. We are bringing our journalism to you, to the world. We're trying to, so anyways, in that sense it's humbling. So at the Chinese website, we also try to have a local voice. So we try to write some original stories for the local audience. We try to, and all of that is challenging for a lot of different reasons. We are still the New York Times, but
And the fact that you are, this isn't working right. And the fact that you are. Did that work? Okay. Sorry, it was user error. And the fact that you are writing now in Chinese for the local audience, are you finding more scrutiny? I mean, I'm not quite sure how it works in China, but I mean, in Vietnam, if you write something that upsets them, they'll contact you.
so absolutely. So now we're not a newspaper, right? We're digital only. If you haven't checked us out, cn.nytimes.com. That's the website. But we also have an app on the Apple, in the App Store. So it is not blocked. If you're Chinese, if you read Chinese, you should download that now and share with your friends. And so the thing about social media, and we are on social media, believe it or not, and in ways you can't imagine, because the New York Times is blocked in China. So we're also blocked on social media, and therefore we have to disguise ourselves. There was the girl with 7 names who escaped from North Korea. Well, we're the New York Times, a newspaper with 7 names, or more than that, because we change our names all the time in order to survive on the Chinese internet. And our latest version, we're X, newspaper X. If you want to look for us on Weibo, we're Mobile. And some people don't know who that is. They don't trust us because there's certainly a lot of people who pretend they're the New York Times. And there are a lot of people out there who publish our stuff and pretend to be the New York Times. So people don't know. So the thing is that on social media, you're free to comment. We hear back from people all the time. And of course, in China, there's the 50-cent party. I don't know if you know. Like government people, trolls, they comment and speak for the party because they're afraid that of the people's voice, so they want to get the party's voice in there. So I can't tell who is commenting, but we do get immediate feedback, and that's part of you always have the 50-centers who say, why are you so biased against China, et cetera, et cetera. And there are also other people who say, we're so proud of the work that you're doing, thank you for being out there. So we do get a sense of both sides.
Are you publishing on WeChat too?
Yes, that's a really good question. We once upon a time had a big audience, and then we lost the audience because every time you build up, they kill us, and we come back again with a different name. And now we have an education channel called NYT Education 语言是教育频道. So it's not. So we can't, and so sometimes if we put anything NYT related, we'll be killed. So we come back again and again with a new name, and we do not put our most sensitive political stories on that channel, or else we'll die again. So there are lots of ways we survive. People, once they get into WeChat, they can probably find our site, look for the other stories, what they can read. But it's a cat and mouse game we play constantly. Download our app. Tell your friends in China.
Now, is there, in terms of, so you guys are constantly having to change in social media your identity. How, I guess for a lot of us, visibility is such an important part, right? We want the Bloomberg name out there. You want to say that you're with VOA. So for you guys, people must naturally find you and think, oh, obviously that's New York Times, but you say there are spoof New York Times as well. So how do you deal with that issue of visibility and credibility?
It's not easy, actually, and for us, sometimes we're afraid to be too prominent. We're afraid to have too high a profile because it's like poking your head out, you'll be shot for sure, right? And so then, how do we gain visibility? So it's sort of like,
Ducking back out.
yeah, exactly. Like when I go and wherever I can, I speak to people. It's sort of like retail campaigning. I go one-on-one. Please download my app. My card, in the back of my card, I have a QR code so you can download our app because we can't really advertise that openly, and so it's. Yeah. So if you got my card, please flip it to the other side and download our app and support the New York Times in China.
I think that illustrates that as a media organization that is trying to project internationally, you need to be very flexible, dynamic, be on different platforms. For example, VOA traditionally was radio. our 45 language services, more than half of them now have television, but in some countries they're seen on satellite television, which may or may not be legal. In some countries we still use shortwave radio, very few, like to broadcast into North Korea. There's no sense putting up a video YouTube channel because nobody can see it in North Korea. Using social media apps, figuring out which ones are popular in certain countries. Trying to make distribution deals with publishers in certain countries with television channels, we do that. Our content's in the public domain, so if other people want to, create a VOA site, there's probably 40 VOA sites in Mandarin Chinese, and some are authorized and some are not, but as long as they're taking our content and using it, the ones that the Chinese authorities do seem to tolerate are the ones that take the content for English language lessons. So that's one way a lot of our content sneaks into China is English language training.
Nice, sneaky. Now, I know with Korea and with Japan, we've got the issue of towing the government line, and I think this is where we get to that issue of self-censorship as well, right? Where here in Korea, there's basically one message from the government, and a lot of local media certainly
Well,
go away from that.
In Korea, they have a defamation law whereby you can be criminally punished for naming somebody and damaging their reputation in public. But the extra point on that, which makes it even more insidious, is the fact that the truth is not an absolute defense in Korea. So you can actually print something which is the truth and verifiable about somebody, but because it damages their reputation, they can sue you. Now, but in practice, what actually does happen is that most of the time, if there is an accusation, the police investigate it, it goes to a prosecutor and possibly a court in Korea, and they do try to protect journalists and say, oh, this was something that the public needed to know. But there's always that constant fear in the back of journalists' minds that they're going to be made an example of, and when they do, write somebody's name who will come after them.
Well, I mean, Brian, I think the issue of self-censorship is a critical one, for Japan as well. I mean, a lot of the Fukushima coverage, for example, was criticized by not going beyond what the government and what TEPCO
Yeah, well, let me start. So self-censorship. So Japan is a country where there's this concept of wa, which is social harmony, and Japanese are raised from childhood to not disturb the wa, not make other people uncomfortable, which if you think about it is not really consistent with what journalists are supposed to do. So one day we interviewed this distinguished executive, Japanese executive, about 75 years old, and the question we were asking about foreign activist investors. And as you probably know, foreign activist investors come in, they buy a small stake in a company, and then they start making all kinds of crazy demands. Raise your dividend, do this, do that. So they're not very popular. And we interviewed this guy, and he said all sorts of things, bad-mouthing foreign activist investors. He used the phrase baka kabanushi, which means idiot investors, which is very strong language in Japan, the country of law. So our reporters came back to the bureau and they wrote these stories. An Irishman wrote the English version, a Japanese woman wrote the Japanese version. And they moved, we moved the stories a couple hours later. We try to make sure that the main points are the same, main quotes are the same. But a couple hours later, I got an email from someone saying that a client had read both versions. They noticed this phrase, idiot investors, in the English language version, but there was no reference to that in the Japanese language version. So I looked at it, and sure enough, this very powerful phrase appears nowhere in the Japanese language story, and really it should have been the headline of both. It says the entire story in 2 words. And so I followed up with the Japanese reporter the next day. Well, you must have heard this comment, why didn't you use it? And she said, well, I had him criticizing them anyway, and I thought that phrase might be a little bit too provocative, might make people uncomfortable. So this is an example where our own people, it's not even the PR people, it's our own people are watering down the story in order not to make people uncomfortable. So that's something we have to fight every day in Japan, to make people more aggressive.
You had a question, right, Phil?
I was a little reticent to say anything because I didn't want to be the stink bug, but it does sound a little self-congratulatory here, and I think the 2 points that should be recognized is that, number one, at least in South Korea, as far as I can say, because I can read Korean, every really good international story that was reported already in the Korean press like a year previous. Like the Salt Flats slavery story, this recent story with the reformatory school that was abusive. All these were reported in the Korean press like a year ago. So that's one thing. So it's easy to be, oh, I have lots of principles when you can't break any stories. So it's much more difficult to have to negotiate that, like what the Japanese reporter said. You have an ongoing relationship with these, the people you're covering. So you have to be tough, but you also have to live with them. So it's like criticizing your cousin or something, or your uncle. You can, but you have to there's a give and take. It's a much more complicated, negotiated relationship. And it's easy when you're just here for 2 years and then you leave, and the company's income is completely divorced from the society. It's like a community reporter versus a big city reporter. The community reporter has a stake in the community, and so the coverage is more nuanced, but also you get to break the story. And as reporters, I think we're all lusting for that ability to get the story that no one else has reported yet. So I just wanted to add that 2 bits, like, for English language press in South Korea, it seems a little bit arrogant and also hypocritical simultaneously.
Hello, Phil.
You should go talk to some of the small town reporters in the United States who have won Pulitzer Prizes by going up to the establishment and having death threats against them and their families and standing up for their principles. So you're right, there is a wider perspective to it, but sometimes I think it just boils down for local reporters and publishers as a matter of courage. It's a lot easier when you have a major multinational corporation behind you. But there are very courageous reporters in South Korea, in Japan, and in China, and Cambodia, and sometimes they pay with their lives. It's a very dangerous profession sometimes.
Can I just say one thing? I agree with you. I say sometimes thank God for censorship. Otherwise, foreign media would never survive, in China at least. If the local media are free to do what they want, they would beat us every single day. So we learn from them every day. So you're absolutely right.
And with that, we're going to call it to a close. Thank you so much, you guys, for sharing.
Hello.
So we have a 15 minutes break.